It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and joining us is a professor at the University of St. Francis and published author, Dr. Adam DeVille. Thanks for being here, Dr. DeVille.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to be back.
The new book, Everything Hidden Shall Be Revealed, Ridding the Church of Abuses of Sex and Power. And we haven't actually had a chance to look at the book ourselves, but been getting a lot of attention. Can you give us a little summary about what the book is about and why you wrote it?
Yeah, this is a book for the future. This is a book that says, what can we do to prevent this from ever happening again, this crisis? And so what I do in there is look at church structures and the need to reform them. I got a little frustrated last year as I'm working on the book because I think too many of us got caught up in our preferred narratives about causes. You know, it's clericalism, it's homosexuality, it's something else. And what I try to do is sort of say, let's not lose the battle here because this is not where we want to fight. We need to fight to prevent these kinds of abuses from breaking out again. And to do that, we need to look at the structures of the church, which have aided the present crisis. And if we change those structures, then we have a much better chance of preventing this crisis from happening again.
How historical are these structures? Is this something that's evolved over time and we've gotten away from what it should have been? Or was it kind of misaligned from the very beginning, you think?
And that's a great question. And that's really what I try to do in the book is sort of remind Catholics of our larger, longer history. Because the present structures, the way things are today in parishes and dioceses, is barely a century old in many respects. And a lot of this comes in not just after Vatican I in the 19th century, but even after the first Code of Canon Law in 1917. So that's not a long time in church history. And so what I try to do is say we had other structures that worked and still work in the Eastern Catholic churches, for example. And let's look at those because those, I think, are much more reliable than what we have right now and give us much greater certainty that it's harder to abuse the system to hide people committing crimes than the present system. So it's very much a book of history and sort of bringing back, the image in the gospel that I often prefer, the householder who brings out treasures both old and new. And part of what I'm trying to do is sort of bring out treasures from our past to say, hey, church, maybe we should look at these again, dust them off and think, could this work now?
On a scale of 1 to 10, how controversial are your suggestions?
Well, I don't think they're controversial at all because they're grounded in history and because they're grounded in theology. But I know for a lot of people, talking about this does make them nervous, and these ideas may strike them as controversial. So I took real pains in the book to say this is grounded in the church's history. This is not taken from an HR manual. This is not taken from the structures of the federal government or from Microsoft. This is not stuff just dreamt up, This is stuff grounded in our own history. This is tradition. So I pitched the book really as a very traditionalist book in the sense that it goes back to Catholic tradition and says, here's when they worked, here's how they worked, here's why we need to think about bringing them back. For some people who think that the current system is the only possible way it could be, the church could be structured, it's going to be controversial. It's going to be difficult, and I recognize that. But I don't think there's a need for it to be controversial if people understand this is grounded in church practice of earlier centuries and church tradition.
And you're not talking about changing dogma.
No, and I specify that very clearly and repeatedly in the first part of the book. I say I am, straight down the line faithful to the teaching of the church. I mean, I hold a mandatum from the bishop of this diocese, and I'm not calling for the change to any of the church's teaching on anything at all. Okay. Because I uphold that as does the whole department at St. Francis, and I'm a man of my word. So this is looking at sort of practical issues of governance. It's not looking at doctrine. And I know some people say, well, you start tampering with structures and governance, you're going to have people voting on doctrine. No, and I lay out in the book how we avoid that, because that's not what I want. Nobody should want that. The faith is given to us by God. It's not up for a vote. But the structures of the church are not given by God in all their particular details. That's up to us. And so I try to make that distinction.
When you're talking about the current church structure, which is at least, I think you're saying, partially responsible for the abuse crisis that we've found ourselves in, how would you describe or define the current structure that needs to be changed?
The word I probably use most often is monopoly. And so you have a monopoly, for example, of the Pope on appointing bishops. You have a monopoly of bishops on appointing parish clergy. There's no reason for that to be. There's no theology behind that, and there's very little history. As I say, that monopoly only dates to the end of the 19th century. And so we know monopolies are not good. We know that monopolies leave themselves open to abuse. And that's what we've seen. And so one way I propose to get past that is to say the monopoly on appointments of parish clergy has to go. And so what I propose in the book is, because we've seen the bishops use and abuse that power to move abusive priests around and not tell the parish why this priest is leaving or why this new guy is suddenly here, and not tell them anything about this guy's past. So what I say in the book is, this isn't substituting one monopoly for another, right? Lay people are going to move in and shove the bishops aside. No, this is a way of saying the parish council has to work in conjunction with the bishop when it's time for a leadership change. And the bishop has to be open and honest with the parish and say, this guy has a problem with whatever it is, and this is why I have to remove him. And then the bishop also has to tell the parish council, here's Father so-and-so, he's a new guy, I would like to appoint him as your pastor. Here's what I know about him. And you can have a confidential discussion between the council and the bishop and say, okay, there's nothing in his personnel file, he's got a clean record, I think he'd be a good fit for your parish. And you work collaboratively to make these kinds of decisions, which is one way, I think, of cutting off the escape route that we've used to shuffle these guys around.
And you talked about your suggestions that they were being done historically. Is this something that was being done historically? These parish councils? Is that
parish councils are a relatively modern phenomenon, which I think is actually a good recent development. The history of parish governance in the past really varies from time and place. The use of a sort of a council, the way we would do it today, as I say, is relatively recent. But you had prominent people in the parish who would have worked with the bishop in determining, okay, Father so-and-so is a suitable fit, or, he's got to go for this reason. So the idea of more than just the bishop making these decisions does have precedence. And that's true even today in the Eastern churches, both Catholic and especially Orthodox.
We're talking with Dr. Adam DeVille. The book is Everything Hidden Shall Be Revealed, Ridding the Church of Abuses of Sex and Power. And how can the general person that's reading the book have any kind of influence over these changes that you're suggesting?
Yeah, and that's really the big question. What I do is I kind of lay out the history. I make the case for here's a different way things could be done. It's really up to the church to kind of pick up the ball and run with it. For people to say, yes, we need this, and to start working towards this and pushing towards this. If you look at it just superficially, it doesn't look like many of the things I'm arguing for have a realistic chance of happening. Because we know from human nature that people who have power are reluctant to give it up, and that's true in the church as it is anywhere else. But if you know Catholic history, you know that major periods of reform in the church have come when people have stood up in sufficient number with sufficient volume and said enough. And we really need to start looking for different models. We really need to start making major changes. And I think there's a groundswell building in this case. I started writing about Catholic abuse in Canada when I was growing up in the 90s, when it really started to emerge in the late 80s and early 90s there. And I have not seen until last summer this kind of sense that there's enough people now willing to say, we need to change. So if that continues, if that momentum is built and people can get a kind of a vision, which the book tries to provide, to guide them, then I think there's a chance of finally getting bishops and popes to stop and listen and say, yeah, this can't go on.
You talked about the monopoly of bishops placing priests and the parish council being a way to fix that. You also talked about the monopoly of popes appointing bishops. What's the fix for that?
Again, within Catholic tradition, there is the model of the diocesan synod, which is a gathering of clergy and lay delegates from each parish, usually on an annual basis. And one of the things synods historically did was elect the bishop. And that's a model that is still used in the Eastern Catholic churches today. So I've been asking for more than 10 years, why do some Catholics get to elect their bishops by synods and others, namely Catholics in the Latin Church, don't? And there's no theological reason for that. It's just this is the way it's developed. This is the current practice from 1917 onward. So it says to me that there's no reason why that can't change. There's all kinds of practical reasons you can look at it, but there's no doctrinal reason, there's no theological reason why some Catholics can have synodal elections of their bishops and others can't.
So how does that look in the Eastern Church? What's the process?
The process right now is, to take my church, for example, the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church, the synod gathers annually in a full session, and it looks around the world and says, okay, we need a bishop in this diocese. And so it does its investigation of possible candidates. It's got that list prepared and the background checks and all that kind of stuff done. And then in the confidential sessions of the synod, the candidates are discussed, and people will then propose, okay, I think Father so-and-so, he's been a pastor for 20 years, done a really good job. I think he would make a good bishop. And then it's put to a vote. And the candidate who is elected will then be contacted and asked if he accepts the election. And if so, then he becomes a bishop.
And how are people chosen to be in the synod?
Right now, in the Eastern Catholic world, the synods are just composed of other bishops. Okay. But historically, in the East and the West, synods have had laity, clergy, parish clergy, and bishops together. And so I look at that broader vision to say synods are good, but synods of just bishops are not the real model, the original model. Here's how we look to have the people from the parishes and the parish clergy involved in those synods.
One of the things you said, and I'll quote, if nothing changes at all, the church is going to continue to collapse and disintegrate and disappear in large parts of the world, end quote. A lot of people have said when everything has been kind of hitting the fan and going crazy, that anytime that this has happened throughout history, the church has survived and even thrived eventually.
Eventually, yeah.
Because of saints rising up and fixes happening.
Yep.
Do you really think that there's a chance that the Catholic Church would disintegrate and collapse if changes are not made?
I think we're seeing that already, certainly in Western Europe and in parts of North America. This is one piece of it. I don't want this to sound like this is the only cause of that. There are other complex social reasons for this. But I think this is really, for some people anyway, this is the last piece. This is the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back. They may have already been on their way out the door. The church may have already been suffering and parishes being closed. But for some people, this is it, which kind of pushes them over the edge. So, yeah, again, though, church history is very helpful here because the church is constantly falling and rising throughout the world. And if it seems to be in a state of real distress and collapse in parts of the West today, it's thriving in other parts of the world, and we know that. And again, that's classic history. You get places that the church basically disappears from. You look across Asia at the end of the first millennium, for example, when so much of the Christianization all the way to China is kind of rolled back. But it's thriving elsewhere. And so I think it can thrive, but it seems to me we do need that kind of dramatic reform and rebirth for it to be able to really take root here and begin the long, slow recovery of any kind of serious teaching authority.
And one of the things I think we always use as a defense is that the issues in the church have not come from the teachings of the church, but people who are not living out the teachings correctly.
Yep.
And so I think that's kind of getting back to what you're saying is you're not suggesting to change the teaching, but just how we are living out the teachings.
Yeah, and part of what I argue is the changes to the structures will help us live out those teachings better. I'll give you an example. People might be threatened by this proposal for lay involvement in the selection of either parish clergy or bishops. But I say, you know what? That is a manifestation of our duty of charity. It helps us to love the bishops and others more fully by helping them bear their burdens. So this is not a power grab or an attempt to change the teaching.
All right. Again, it's called Everything Hidden Shall Be Revealed, Ridding the Church of Abuses of Sex and Power. Dr. Adam DeVille, thank you so much for sharing it with us today.
You're welcome.